Okay, so this is my lecture on the problem of evil, the reading by Hick, John Hick. So on my front slide, by the way, it says the problem of evil on my PowerPoint. For those of you who have access to my PowerPoints, you don't really need them to follow this if you're not in the class and viewing this at a later date. But I have Epicurus, Hick, and Kahn, C-A-H-N, the subtitle of my lecture, and a picture of Hitler, because he's a kind of personification of evil on slide 1. So the next slide, we go back to Epicurus, who's an ancient Greek philosopher who posed a riddle. It's only about a paragraph long, and it goes something like this. If God is willing to prevent evil, but is not able to, right, he lacks the power, then he's not omnipotent, all-powerful. If he is able, he has the power, but not willing, he doesn't have the will to prevent evil, then he is malevolent, meaning evil-natured, right? Whereas God is supposed to be good-natured. If he is both able, all-powerful, and willing, all-good or omnibenevolent, then whence cometh evil? Where does evil come from if God is all-powerful and all-good? If he is neither able, not all-powerful, nor willing, not all-good, then why call him God? So that's the end of it. That's the riddle of Epicurus, or the puzzle of Epicurus, right? The last particular line, then why call him God, reminds me of something that I mentioned. That's my parakeet, by the way. Reminds me of something that I mentioned in my lecture on Plato's Euthyphro about what it means to be God. I said that in my jogging around Bensonhurst when I was training for the marathon, plural marathons, I frequently would pass a Muslim temple, a mosque, an Ahmadiyya temple on West 8th Street, I think, around Avenue S. Had a big banner across the top, carved into the stone, no being is worthy of worship except Allah. The key word for that for me is worthy, right? Being worthy of worship, to worship another being in a way that's worthy, that for them to be worthy, they have to be Allah or God, right? But even God would have to be good, right? If you imagine that we were created by an all-powerful being who was not all good, right? Like the way that a computer programmer could create a little world with conscious beings in it, but the programmer wasn't good. Now, you might want to kind of appease that programmer to get powers handed to you within the program, right? And you might even worship them, but they wouldn't be morally worthy. They wouldn't be worthy of worship, right? So to be morally worthy of worship, you have to be morally good, right? You have to be the essence of goodness. So when Epicurus says, if he's not all powerful and all good, then why call him God? He's implicitly making a similar argument as that's being made on the temple, that mosque, that no being is worthy of worship except God, right? It implies that God is worthy of worship. For God to be worthy of worship, God has to be all good, right? So, but if God is all good, then why is there evil in the world, right? This is the problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world? If the world was created by our Father, the all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful being that we take God to be. Okay, so the atheist, the non-believer, converts Epicurus's riddle into an argument, which can be called the argument from evil, or more generally, the argument from imperfection. So we're on slide 2 now, which is the next slide. Atheist's argument from evil/imperfection. And an argument is a conclusion with premises in support of it, right? A what statement, what you believe, and reasons why, the premises, right? The what you believe That's your conclusion. Why you believe it, those are your premises. So that's the argument from evil. It's an argument. An argument is premises and conclusion, or a what and a why. Right? So premise one, if there is a, I would add, traditional God, and a little hold an asterisk there for what that means, then there would be no evil or imperfection in the world. And the reason for adding the idea of imperfection is that a perfect being should create a perfect world. It's like a perfect watchmaker would create perfect watches, not bad watches, right? Premise two, but there is evil or imperfection in the world. Look around. This is not a perfect world. Conclusion, thus there's no such God. Right? And I say no such God. There might be a God, like Epicurus says, who lacks being all powerful, or who isn't all loving. But then you might want to say such a being isn't even worthy of the word God. Right? But that's a dispute about whether or not such a being is worthy of the name. Right? That's Epicurus's idea. And the idea also on the mosque, about no being worthy of worship except God, implies that God has to, for something to be God, it has to be all good. Right? So I said asterisk about the traditional concept of God. We're not talking about the goddess Kali, for example, a Hindu goddess who has followers called thuggees who sacrifice human beings to her, right, or something like that. We're talking about the Western monotheistic concept of God, the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or just more abstractly, that same God, whether or not you accept those religions. Okay, so the traditional concept of God, setting aside other kinds of gods, has three major characteristics. One, he's all-knowing, omniscient. Omni means all, and shint is S-C-I-E-N-T, just like the word science means knowing, right? I think it's Latin. I'm confused my Greek and Latin, but I think that's a Latin one. Omnipotent, all potent or all powerful, right? The opposite of impotent, which is powerless. And omnibenevolent, you could say, all benevolent, all good-natured, all loving, right? So now think about it. Premise one said, if there is a traditional God, a God with those three characteristics, then there'd be no evil or imperfection in the world. Break it down. If God is all-knowing, then he knows how to prevent evil or how to create a perfect world. If he's all-powerful, then he's able to prevent evil or imperfection, right? He's able to create a world that's perfect and that lacks evil. And if he's all omnibenevolent, he's all good-natured, then he intends to create a perfect world, a world without evil. So if God knows how to create a perfect world, he has the power to do so, and he wants to do so. This should be a perfect world without evil. That's premise one. Right? God is a perfect being, and he's perfectly good. That's the atheist's intuition. Right? That's the same intuition that Epicurus had, and I think that intuition is on the mosque. No being is worthy of worship except Allah. To be worthy is to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving and all-good, right? Otherwise, it's not worthy, right? In fact, the good-natured part of it is the most important when it comes to being worthy of worship, arguably. Right? So that's the argument in favor of premise one. Premise two, there is evil and imperfection in the world. That's why my opening slide had Hitler on it, all right? And certainly, if you lose your Wi-Fi connection every now and then, there's your proof that this is not a perfect world. Well, Professor, I was taking the quiz and I lost my Wi-Fi. Oh, yeah, okay. Remember that. Not a perfect world. All right, so look, here's the argument. It's very simple. If this is the case, that would be the case. But that's not the case. Therefore, this is not the case, right? If it's raining out, then the streets will be wet. But the streets are not wet. Therefore, it's not raining out, right? That kind of thing. All right, next slide. So this slide doesn't have a heading, but the first bulleted point says valid argument. The logic is good, right? This is a valid argument, the argument from evil, right? And a valid argument is an argument where the logic is good. And what does it mean to say that the logic is good in an argument or that it's valid? Is to say this: if the following criterion is satisfied, then the argument has good logic or it's valid. And here's that criterion. If the premises were true, then the conclusion must be true. Not if they are true, if they were true, because it's a separate question whether or not premises are true, right? Then I give an example, okay? All A's are B's, that's premise 1. Premise 2, all B's are C's. Conclusion, what can you infer from that? If all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then you can conclude, therefore, all A's are C's, right? Now, my notes here on my slide are about diagrams, which I would do in class, but I can't do here. But you can visualize this. To create a diagram that says that all A's are B's, imagine that everything in this little circle is a member of the set of all things that are A's, right? Everything inside this little circle is an A. And then a bigger circle overlapping it, including all of the A's, right? Down here, a little circle inside, right? Or like a little circle over there or whatever, right? That's the smaller circle inside this larger circle. This larger circle is the set of all things that are B's. That's my parakeet. I apologize for that. Okay, so statement 1, all A's are B's, is just that this larger set B includes the smaller set, everything that's in A, right? That's what it would look like to say all A's are B's in a diagram, right? Now, that's what it would look like if everything that's an A in the smaller circle is included in the circle, the larger circle of all things that are B's, right? So now, that's the first premise and what it would look like if it was true. To diagram the second premise, all B's are C's, you just need a larger circle that includes the B circle in it, which includes the A circle in it, right? All B's, the things in the intermediate size circle, are C's. C circle is larger and includes the B circle, and the B circle is smaller, but includes the A circle, which is even smaller, right? So all B's are C's, puts the intermediate circle in the larger circle, right? So everything that's in the B circle is also in the C circle. So all B's are C's, right? So now just all I verbally described is the diagramming of the first two premises. All A's are B's and all B's are C's, right? Now, if those premises were true, that's what it would look like, right? That diagram, A's, B's, C's. So if all A's are B's and all B's are C's, it follows logically that all A's are C's because the A circle is also inside the C circle. It's in the B circle, but the B circle is in the C circle. So it's included and included, right? So if the premises were true, the conclusion must be true because it's built into what the premises mean, right? You can logically infer it or extract it or deduce it. That's what a deduction or a conclusion or an inference is, something that you can infer, logically extract, logically deduce, logically conclude, right? That's your conclusion, right? So an argument is valid when the premises lead logically in that way to the conclusion, or in some other way, logically lead to the conclusion, right? Like you could think, if P, then Q, and if Q, then R. So if P, then Q, if Q, then R. So no, P leads to Q, and then Q leads to R, right? So 1, 2, like that, right? So therefore, if P, then R, right? That's not using circles, that's using just each letter, P, Q, and R represent different propositions, right? Like, if John is a bachelor, then John is not married. If John is not married, then John does not have a spouse. Therefore, if John is a bachelor, John does not have a spouse, right? That kind of thing. So that's the same thing. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true because the meaning of the conclusion is built into the meaning of the premises, right? So if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. That's what it means for an argument to be logically valid, okay? Okay, so the argument from evil is logically valid because it says, if this was the case, that would be the case. But that's not the case, therefore this is not the case, right? Like I said, if it's raining out, the streets will be wet. But the streets are not wet, therefore it's not raining out, right? Okay, so when you don't like a conclusion of an argument, there could be two possible ways that the argument could be no good, or that you could reject the argument or find flaw in the argument. You can't just say, well, I don't like it, or I just disagree with the conclusion, right? Because that's not what we're doing in philosophy. We want to know, why don't you like the argument? What's wrong with the argument? You have to give a reason for rejecting the argument, right? So if you don't like, if you're a believer and the conclusion of the argument from evil is that there's no such God who's all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, right? Either the argument's logic has to be bad, or one of the premises has to be bad. Like premise 1 said, if there's a God, there wouldn't be evil. Premise 2 said there is evil. So you either have to deny that if there's a God that there wouldn't be evil, you have to say that's wrong, or you have to say, well, there really isn't any evil in the world, right? One of the premises has to be wrong, right? So like in my argument, I said, oh, if John is a bachelor, then you can say, well, John's not a bachelor, right? That kind of thing. Okay, so then maybe John does have a wife, right? But if the premises were true, then John couldn't have a wife, right? So if the argument is valid, then and you don't like the conclusion, one of the premises has to be wrong. One of the premises, or all of the premises could be false, right? So either the logic is bad or the premises are no good. But if the logic is good, then the only way you could critique the argument is to go after the premises. And I'm saying that the logic is good in this argument. It's like, if P, then Q. But it's not the case that Q, therefore it's not the case that P, right? And that's logically valid. That can be proven very easily, but that's another lesson, all right? So when an argument is both valid, meaning it has good logic, and its premises are true, that's a good argument. That's the best possible argument. We call that a sound argument, right? But an argument can be unsound, meaning you could reject it if it's either invalid or one of or more of its premises are false. Either or both. It could be invalid and all of its premises are false, right? But it could just be it's invalid, but its premises are all true, or it could be valid, but even just one of its premises is wrong, right? It has to have everything for it to be a sound argument. And a sound argument is a perfect argument, right? But if it's missing, either the logic is off, or one of the premises is off, or more, or all of it is off, right? Or all of them are bad, it's invalid, and all false premises, doesn't matter. If there's any one thing wrong with an argument, it's unsound. All right, but it's only invalid if its logic is bad. Okay, so this is just terminology that logicians use. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So yeah, I have an example. If P, then Q, not Q, the little squiggly mark that's like a sideways little S instead of a hyphen, like a curled hyphen. It's called the tilde. It's in the upper left-hand corner of your keyboard, right under the escape key, right? Logicians use that to mean negation or not, right? So P arrow Q, the arrow means if then, right? If P, then the arrow leads you to Q. First premise, second premise, but not Q. Q is false. Thus, P is false, not P, right? That argument is equivalent to the argument from evil, right? We call it the argument from evil, by the way, because the premise is that there's evil in the world, right? So there's an argument from imperfection, that there's imperfection in the world, right? And when we make certain arguments, right, there could be several arguments for the existence of God, several arguments for the non-existence of God, or several arguments for anything. But if there's many arguments for a certain thing, we will name the argument from this premise or the argument from that premise, right? It's just the way that philosophers like. We like to give names to arguments so that we could easily refer to them without having to repeat the whole argument. Okay, so I say the argument from evil is valid logically, but are the premises true? So like I said, to resist the premises, to resist the argument, you have to resist one of the premises. Oh, I wanted to say this. The best way that you could convince somebody of your conclusion, like what you believe, whatever that is, your conclusion, is to give them a sound argument for it, right? To take them from premises that they recognize as true or credible or plausible and show them that they lead logically to your conclusion. If you show that premises are true that lead logically to your conclusion, then your conclusion is established. If they don't want to accept it, they're doing this kind of thing, la, 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 right? But the argument stands on its own merits, right? So I don't like the argument. Well, so what? It's been shown to be sound. It's valid. The logic is good and the premises are true, right? So that's why philosophers are all about argument analysis. We want to say, is this a good argument? Are the premises true? Is it sound? Right? The sound argument for something is the best that you could give for it. Okay, so if you're a believer and you don't like the argument from evil because you don't like the conclusion that says there's no such God, and I'm telling you the logic is good, you have to find flaw with one of the premises. Which one? Premise 1, which says that if there's a God, then there'd be no evil and imperfection, or premise 2 that says, well, there is evil and imperfection. All right, next slide. Next slide says, challenge premise 2. We'll do that one first, the idea that there's no evil in the world, right? Is there no evil or imperfection in the world? We'll pick that one first because I think it's easier to get rid of, that's a mistake. It's hard to deny. So, or imperfection, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, mudslides, avalanches, droughts, hurricanes, diseases, all of these things cause great destruction, suffering, injury, illness, death, loss to many innocent lives. Hurricane Sandy happened recently, well, a few years ago on our campus actually, right, causing lots of destruction. So it's hard to say that there's no real evil in the world. Next slide. A great philosopher named Leibniz rejected the idea that there's real evil in the world. Proposition 2, there's evil in the world. He kind of spins the argument from evil in a different way, right? So his premise 1 goes something like this. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, then this world must be the best of all possible worlds, right? Because like we said, if he knows how, and he wants to, and he's able to create a perfect world, then this must be the most perfect world that's possible, the best conceivable or the best world that's possible. Not just even conceivable, because maybe God could conceive of things that are even better than what we could conceive of. So it would have to be the best world possible, because God could know all possibilities, right? That's premise 1. If God is all of that, then this must be the best of all possible worlds. And that quote, best of all possible worlds, is famously associated with this philosopher, Leibniz. Second premise, I'll shorten it. God is all of that. That's what God is by definition. That's what it means to be God, to be that kind of being. Conclusion, therefore, this is the best possible world. Right? And if this is the best possible world, then there can't be any suffering in the world that's really pointless. If there's any suffering in the world, it's all part of God's grand scheme and his divine plan, his multiply complex orchestration of everything that turns out absolutely exquisitely perfect in the end, right? We just can't see it. An analogy some philosophers make is if you're just learning how to play chess and you're playing with a grandmaster chess player, you could barely understand 2 or 3 moves ahead of you, but he could understand the whole game. From one move that you make, he could know how the game's going to end or something like that, right? And God is like that chess master. So when things look like there's pointless evil or suffering or imperfection in the world, that's just from our ignorant perspective. From God's perspective, everything is absolutely exquisitely perfect, down to the last detail. Okay, I mentioned that Voltaire, that philosopher, who wrote that little story about the Brahmin who has all the wisdom and knowledge in the world. He's very unhappy because he knows the limits of his knowledge and it's hard for him to believe any of it. Voltaire wrote a book called Candide, which is explicitly written to be a mockery of Leibniz's idea. Because one of the main characters in the story has all these treacherous, obviously wicked things intentionally designed to be exploitative and destructive. And like no matter what happens to this character, they always see the bright side. It kind of makes the character look like an idiot. And this is a kind of, that's a criticism of the idea that, come on, all the horrible things in this world are part of, God intended them that way and designed them that way? Very hard to believe. In other words, not very credible. All right? Okay. So next slide, I have just a picture of some evil people like Hitler, Vlad the Impaler, who I would like to say was so evil. Not only did he impale people, put their heads on a spike, you know, their whole body hanging with the spike going through their neck, and leave them out there, die shaking on a spike, and their bodies lied around the countryside wherever he conquered, so his enemies would have terrifying fear of that being their fate. Not only did he impale people on spikes, but a story, I don't know if it's true, but I remember reading this, is that he had dungeons under his bedroom where people were tortured all night long so that the sound of their torture would help to lull him to sleep. Right now, evil in a way is a professor that I knew at Brooklyn College named Abigail Rosenthal. She wrote a book called A Good Look at Evil, and she said evil is the motive. It's not just an action, it's a motive. What defines evil is the motive to cause suffering to innocent beings for the joy that it brings you to see them suffer. Absent that motive, if you are, say, causing the exact same action, but you think that you're enacting vengeance on someone who deserves it, right, then that's not an evil motive, right? And action is significantly determined to be good or evil by the motive of the person performing the action. And for an action to be evil, it has to be that. Now, there might be something less drastic than that that makes something evil, but I think that motive is clearly evil, right? So Vlad could sleep. He'd get lulled to sleep by having that evil motive satisfied, it seems. That puts him on the chart up there with Hitler. I put myself there, Rick Rapetti, a picture of me, because I'm the one who gives you quizzes and exams and makes you read and watch these videos, so I must be evil. And then there's a picture of a fellow named Mort Wagman. I put that there as a joke, only because when I made this PowerPoint, professors are frequently observed by other professors and then they evaluate them. Right? At the time, Professor Wagman was a senior faculty member in my department who was coming to that class to observe me. So I put that picture of his on there just as a joke that professors who observe other professors are evil. Okay, so much for that joke. Next slide. It says theodicy, defense of God's goodness. So you need to learn this word theodicy. Theo means God. If you're a theist, you're a believer in God. If you're a polytheist, you believe in many gods. Monotheist, you believe in one God, right? Those all come from theo in Greek, which means God, or Dio, or in Italian, or Dios, or Dieu in French, and so on. So the word theodicy comes from theo, right? But also from a Greek word dikon, D-I-K-O-N, dikon, which means righteousness. So God's righteousness or God's goodness. But philosophers and theologians use a theologian is the logic of God, right? Believers analyzing the statements in the Bible are theologians. They're analyzing the logic and defending the logic of God. But when it comes to God's goodness, it's God's righteousness, theodikon, right? Theodicy. Which is the defense of God's goodness against the problem of evil, right? So this problem is so big in religion that the attempt to even answer the problem has a name, theodicy. All right, how could it be that God is really good but allows massive evil? Now, I want you to think about theodicy not only in the context of this religion, monotheism, but even other religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. Right? The theodicy, the explanation for evil, in Hinduism and Buddhism alike is karma and reincarnation. So karma is the theory of like what comes around goes around, and what goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. Your actions have reactions. Everything that you do creates your own future, right? It's your karma. Right now, like in monotheism, we believe in karma also, right? But we believe that what you do will, of course, contribute to what happens to you in this life, but more importantly, in the afterlife, right? Your good or bad karma sends you to heaven or hell, respectively. Now, Hindus and Buddhists have this exact same idea, but they also have the idea of reincarnation, so that you just keep coming back until you have no more karma left, right? And then you become kind of free and enlightened. They have very different ways of interpreting this idea of the ultimate state of nirvana or enlightenment and how you get there. But they both do share this idea. And I say it's a theodicy for them, even though the Buddhists don't believe in a creator God who orchestrates karma. Both Buddhists and Hindus believe that the laws of karma are built into the structure and the nature of reality in the universe, right? Like they're kind of like Newton's laws of cause and effect built into the fabric of reality. Hindus believe God put it there. Buddhists believe that it's just part of the way things are. That's just how cause and effect works, right? So the Buddhists don't have to say, why is God good? But they still have to say, like, how does evil happen in a world where we have this beautiful religion of Buddhism and beings like Buddhas, which are similar to gods, even though they're not necessarily gods, right? And there are gods in Buddhism, but they're like just kind of like angelic beings or whatever. They're not like God with a capital G, and you don't necessarily go through them to get to heaven or something like that, right? But nonetheless, the more abstract idea is that how does a religion explain evil when all religions have this idea that fundamentally existence is ultimately good, right? So the point about me bringing this up is just to note that when you ask, why do bad things happen to innocent people, right? That's particularly the problem in all religions. Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, in the monotheistic religions, right, we say, well, the people who do the bad things will go to hell, and their innocent victims will hopefully go to heaven, and it'll all be evened out in the afterlife, and God's watching over the whole thing, and even though it doesn't seem just and fair, in the end it will be. But when it comes to Hinduism and Buddhism, when bad things happen to good or innocent people, the answer is, well, they're only look innocent in this life, but they've been around many times. So like if a baby burns to death in a fire or something, you might think, well, maybe that baby was Hitler in a previous life, or someone who put a baby into a gas chamber or in a cremation, oven or something like that, right? So whereas in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, a baby is a first new being. It's a new soul. It doesn't have a history, right? So in a way, Hinduism and Buddhism, their theodicy, the explanation for evil or the goodness of God or of the higher power or just the ultimate goodness of the universe, is explained even in the most difficult to explain cases, like when an innocent soul, a baby, gets burnt to death, right? The answer in the monotheistic religions is not as strong. It's not as coherent or plausible, just from a logical point of view. If that baby is not innocent, and it's its karma because it's reincarnated, right? That would explain it in a very straightforward way. I'm not saying that it's true, but I'm just comparing theodicies. So just to give you an idea, this is philosophy of religion, right? So theodicy is not restricted to monotheistic religions, all right? And the idea is that when not only when evil, but also good seem to go unrewarded or unpunished, the law of karma guarantees and reincarnation. Oh, he died, he never suffered, Hitler, he took the pill, he died, and, well, in the Judeo-Christian religion, he goes to hell, but in the karma and reincarnation view, it'll catch up with him sooner or later, either way. So it's just two different theodicies. Okay. and this is also on my next slide, right? That how karma works, you know. Your choices contribute to your actions, right? Your intention is everything. Like I said, an evil intention. An action could be good or evil, depends on the intention. So you have an intention, which is desire, some end goal that you want. Then you perform the action. That once you perform an act, you act on a desire, then you give it more power, and then it has consequences. All of that, the intention, the action, and the consequences, when they come back to you, all that's part of karma. All right? It's influenced by it, but so like even in the future, the more you perform an action, right, it becomes a habit, it becomes a disposition, it becomes part of your nature. So those things reincarnate with you, right, and then they lead to you more. But you always have free will, according to this view, in my view anyway. That's my analysis of it, right? And your karma determines what kind of reincarnations you're going to have, right? Okay, so there's an abstract thing called just world theory. I want to bring that in now because whether or not there's a God, like in Buddhism or whatever, or many gods or whatever, all religions seem to partake of a thing called just world theory. So whether there's a God who guarantees that there's a just world, or it's built into karma and reincarnation, or yin and yang, right, which is in Taoism, Taoism, or Daoism from China, which is from martial arts, and acupuncture and Chinese medicine are all very strongly influenced from, if not directly, aspects of Taoism, right? All of these different religious, spiritual philosophies, they all adhere to a just world view. So more abstractly, you could say that theodicy is whether or not there's a God, it's kind of the defense of the idea that we're in a just world, that there's justice in the world, regardless of what happens, right? So theodicy is one kind of just world theory. That's just a kind of classification for understanding. Okay, so now on my next slide, I say, this is all a tangent, but you know, what the heck. Compare theodicies. That's the title of the next slide. So which theodicy seems more compassionate, right? In Western theodicy, God gave us free will, as Hick says, and we create evil, right? Well, we didn't get to that yet, but if you read Hick, you know that that's his primary defense for theodicies, that God gave us free will and we create evil. That's part of the monotheistic Western theodicy, right? But you get one lifetime that determines your eternal fate in heaven or hell. Innocent children suffer through no fault of their own. Hitler might have killed millions of beings. One other person might only commit one serious sin, and both wind up in the same hell forever, right? So that's that. That's the Western theodicy. Now, if a criterion for a religion being more likely to be true was its theodicy, right, its explanation of evil, then it seems that the Hindu and Buddhist theodicy seems more likely to be true than religions that have a heaven and hell theodicy, because you get an infinite number of chances to get it right. You just keep reincarnating, you pay for all your sins, and then you get it all right, right? Okay, so I just wanted to make you think about that. Well, I've heard from some of my Muslim students, I don't know, I'm not an expert on it, that in Islam, even if you go to hell, it's not a permanent hell. It's more like the Catholic idea of purgatory, where there's heaven, there's hell, and there's purgatory. If you're a little bad, not so bad, you purge your sins, you pay for them by suffering somewhat in purgatory, and then you get to go to heaven. So according to some of my students, the Islamic conception of hell is like purgatory. It's not permanent. You suffer there until you're clear and pure and clean or whatever, and then you get to go to heaven. So everybody wants. So actually, if a criterion for a religion was its theodicy, right, the Islamic one that says, yeah, you suffer, but you pay for your sins and then you go to heaven, that seems more compassionate than the Christian or Catholic view, which says, no, you wind up in hell forever if you wind up in hell. There's no exit. It's like the Hotel California, right? In that song, it's a kind of joke. So that's just an interesting thing to consider. And I'm not so certain about the Jewish afterlife because I've heard so many different theories from different kinds of Jewish students that I've had. Some say there is, some say there's not, some say there's a soul, there's not a soul, it's all about this life only, or I don't know, I can't say. I plead ignorance on that. Okay, so next slide. I know we went off on some tangents, but backing up, so far when it comes to the argument from evil, we went for premise 2 first, the idea that there's no evil in the world. And I think that we showed that that doesn't make that much sense, right? So now let's go to premise 1. Must God create a perfect world? That's the title of the next slide. Challenge P1, premise 1. And Hick says no. Hick says there's 2 kinds of evil, moral and natural, or non-moral, right? And by natural, he means hurricanes and things like what nature does. And moral evil is things that human beings do. You know, hurricanes can't be immoral, but human beings can be. So human things that we do, like sin, that's immoral. But when nature causes destruction, or it seems like the world is imperfect because of hurricanes and mudslides and all that, that's natural. He calls it natural evil. I would just say that's imperfection. So you see how the 2 arguments, the argument from evil and the argument from imperfection, they wind up being the same argument. All right? So it depends on what you want to call it. The argument from evil and imperfection, or the argument from moral evil and not natural evil. It's the same thing, just described with different language. So when it comes to moral evil, right, the theodicy that Hick offers for that is free will. Right? God gave us free will. And free will is a good thing. Without it, we'd be puppets. But we make bad choices. That's what free will means. You choose between good or evil. So evil comes from us. When it comes to natural evil, why are there hurricanes and things like that? Right? Things that nature causes. The theodicy that Hick offers for that, John Hick, not Hicks, Hick. Right? Hick's theory is the theory of Mr. Hick, not the theory of Mr. Hicks, all right? Hick's theodicy for natural evil, for hurricanes and things like that, is that we need to live in a real world, a world that's dangerous and that has real consequences in order for our free will to matter. All right, it's interesting, but I'm going to have slides on each of these things. So next slide is Hick's theodicy for moral evil, free will. That's the heading of it. And I have a picture of a robot family. 2 robot parents and a little robot kid, right? Which is the idea that if we didn't have free will, we'd be puppets or robots. You can't have, Hick's idea is that you can't have free will and not have evil, right? If you have free will, that's what makes choosing evil possible. If we couldn't choose evil, it wouldn't be free will, right? So he argues that it's logically impossible to be a puppet and a free agent or a real person at the same time. A real person is an individual with its own will separate from God's will, right? If I have a little hand puppet and I'm God, and that little hand puppet is you, student X, let's just say, and you want to be in a relationship with God, and God wants to have student X love him, God says, oh, I love you, God, Repetti. I wouldn't really, as Repetti or God, I wouldn't really think that this hand loved me, right? In order for me, this is an argument from a brilliant philosopher and a theologian, I think, named Eleanor Stump. She makes the argument that in order for God to even have friends, to be in real friendship relationships with beings of any kind, he has to make beings that are separate from him, that have wills of their own, and that can enter freely into a relationship with God or choose not to. Otherwise, it would be like, I love you, God. Aw, my hand loves me, right? Like, no, you have to have your own will. It's an interesting argument. It's a defense of the idea of why God had to give us free will if God wanted to enter into relationships with us of our own free will. Like also, if God created me and then chained me to a radiator and said, I'm going to whip you until you love me, right, and force me to love him through painful means, that wouldn't be the same thing either, right? Even though I had some free will, if he's going to torture me like that, right? So we need to have real free will, okay? And Hick thinks it's logically impossible to have no free will and be a real person on the one hand, or to be a real person that has free will and never choose evil. Right? That's what free will means. And the idea is you can't have your cake and eat it too. Now, you might know what that statement means. You can't have it both ways, but what I never understood that statement until I really thought about it. It means like, yes, I have my cake or my money. I want to eat the cake, and it's so good. I wish I still had it. I got my first paycheck. I love it. I want to spend it, but I want to still have it after I spend it. You can't do both. If you spend it, you no longer have it. If you eat it, you no longer have it, right? So it's got to be one or the other. So the idea is that we're better off as real beings, separate from, not hand puppets of God, right? Which unfortunately comes with evil as a consequence, because we have to be able to choose in order to have free will. So evil is a necessary byproduct of free will. And we're better off being real beings who have our own existence and free to choose the kind of lives we want to live than we would be if we were little puppets or robots, hand puppets of gods, right? In a perfect world. Perfect world, no evil. Love you, God. Right, that kind of thing. That's the defense of moral evil, free will. Okay? Next slide, his defense of Hick's theodicy for natural evil, which is what I say. He doesn't use this term, but I say he's arguing that we need to be in a non-cartoon world, right? Because if we were in a cartoon-like world, what happens when Wile E. Coyote is running away from the roadrunner, or chasing the roadrunner rather, and falls off a cliff 1,000 feet, splatters on the ground. He's like a pancake, and then he just peels himself back up again. Or when Bugs Bunny shoots Daffy Duck in the face with a shotgun and his beak rolls around his head and then it just kind of stops, right? Like in a cartoon world, nobody can really get seriously injured, right? It's like a fantasy, which is why kids don't want to grow up. They love their cartoons, right? Anything is possible in a cartoon. Nobody can get hurt, right? If we had free will, but we never had consequences, our free will wouldn't matter. We'd be like children who would never grow up. It's kind of like, also like dreams. When you wake up from a dream, you go, oh, thank God. I thought I was, got arrested for doing this horrible thing, but it was only a dream. It doesn't change who I am or how my life is going to unfold at all, right? It had no real consequences because it was merely a dream. So a dream world and a cartoon world, worlds without consequences, are such that our free will wouldn't matter. Right? It's only because when we make bad choices that we experience negative consequences that we can learn from them and grow. And also, like, you can't be courageous in a dream world or in a cartoon world because you can't really be hurt. Right? You can't be courageous if you can't be hurt. Right? I'm very courageous because nothing can ever happen to me. Right? It's like Superman, but there's no such thing as kryptonite. Right? How could he be brave if he can't be hurt? Which is a problem for Jesus being the Son of God. If he really is God, how could he really be hurt? But that's a sidebar. That just came to me now. So the idea is that in order for our free will to matter, we have to be in a real world with real consequences, a world where there's real danger, right? If I gave away all my money, then it miraculously reappeared. That's me having my cake and eat it too, right? I could never really be generous. How could you be generous if everything you give away you automatically still have, right? This is the idea. So in order for our free will to matter, we need to be in a non-cartoon or a non-dream world with real dangerous consequences. Right? And what Hick says, if there were no consequences, money stolen would miraculously reappear without altering the economy. But if you're a realist and you understand the economy, you know that that wouldn't work, right? Without causing inflation and so on. Or you could eat 1,000 donuts without having to worry about gaining weight or getting diabetes or anything like that. Sometimes I wish I was in that world because I want to just keep eating donuts. Right? But you could also commit every kind of sin without ever suffering or causing harm to anyone else. Right, but then nothing would matter. How could you grow? How could a child even mature without consequences? Right? So how could human souls become worthy of entering into a relationship or choosing the good as opposed to the evil and entering into a relationship with God as opposed to Satan, let's just say, or the devil? Right? So next slide. Hick says, if there were no laws of nature, there could be no science or medicine. We wouldn't know what to expect, like gravity, weather, seasons, day and night, etc. But pause for a moment. Think about no science or medicine, right? Without laws of nature, we couldn't have science or medicine. We wouldn't need science or medicine if we were in this heaven-like dream world where nobody could get hurt. We could fly at will, and my arm came off, I'd just put it right back on. I wouldn't need any of those things. So Hick wasn't thinking that one through when he said that. All right, as far as not knowing what to expect with gravity and the seasons, I can get that. Like, how could you play basketball if there's no gravity? You leap up in the air and you just keep going, right? So gravity is necessary, but unfortunately, you know, people fall and hurt themselves because of gravity. Okay. If there were no challenges, nothing would matter to anyone. We couldn't develop virtues like courage, generosity, or anything like that. Free choices wouldn't determine what kind of being you became. We could never grow up morally or spiritually. Right? So next slide. Two theodicies combined, soul making. Right? So Hick says something like this. Recap. The theodicy for moral evil is free will, and the theodicy for natural evil is non-cartoon world that we need to be in. Put them together. Hick sometimes only refers to the non-cartoon world part as soul making, but they're interconnected. Right? Free will wouldn't matter if we were in a cartoon world. So combined, we need free will in a real world with real consequences in order for us to make the kinds of souls that we become. So Hick has this argument or his view is that God makes us partially formed. He gives us the starting kit of a mind, a body, senses in a real world with free will. And then we, through our experimentation, our choices, and our learning, gravitate toward the good or the evil freely of our own making. And then we make the kind of being that we become, who Eleanor Stump, that philosopher who said God doesn't want puppet friends. We make the kind of being that becomes worthy of heaven or hell, of being in a relationship with God or the devil, right? So to become a real soul, a real godlike being made in the image and likeness of God, a person, one must have free will in a world of real consequences, right? But then I ask at the bottom of that slide, but isn't heaven like that? Like a cartoon-like dream world where nobody can get hurt and nobody makes evil choices? That's problematic. I'll just put that out there for you to think about. But then that also reminds me of the problem of Adam and Eve. Right? They were in a paradise-like world, right? But they did have free will. But they only exercised it once wrongly, and then bam, then they fell into a world of real consequences. But without a world of real consequences, they could never earn their way into heaven. But the heaven that they earned their way into is the paradise that they fell from. Right? And that is part of the idea that we were originally made in harmony with God. We fell from God by using our will, but our will is the most important thing, according to Hick, our free will that enables us to wind up back in that perfect state. When you put all these things together, they kind of make sense on one level, but they kind of don't make sense on another level. But just mentioning that now. My next slide says Hick, victory with limitations. So you could conclude that if Hick's argument makes sense, and to a certain extent it does, even though there are problems with it, he has shown that proposition 1 or premise 1 in the argument from evil is false. God and evil are not contradictory. Remember premise 1. If there is a traditional God, then there would be no evil or imperfection in the world. But if Hick is right, and God wanted us to be independent of him and have free will, then there would be evil in the world created by a loving God who wants to enter into free relationships with free human beings. Right? So the atheist's argument from evil and Epicurus' idea is that the very concept of God and the concept of evil contradict each other, because knows how to get rid of evil, wants to get rid of evil, able to get rid of evil, should be no evil. False. It's not that there should be no evil. he also wants free individual beings who have free will and who can choose evil. And because he's loving and wants to be in a relationship with them, he allows them to make evil mistakes, which get justified in the end through their own suffering. They pay for their own evil, right? So it's not that God, the concept of God is inconsistent with the existence or the concept of evil. They're not contradictory like bachelor and married, right? The atheist acts like, in that argument, as if they're contradictory like bachelor and married. But Hick is saying, no, no, no. It's more subtle and complicated than that. They are not contradictory. I've shown how they could both possibly be true together, in which case premise one is false. And remember what I said. An argument fails if either one of its premises are false or its logic is false. Now, the logic in the argument is good, but premise one is false. If Hick's argument is decent, and it is pretty decent. So Hick defeated the argument from evil, in my opinion. Right? But he admits that it's a limited victory, right? That it only shows the possibility that God and evil are not contradictory concepts. You could have both if everything that he said is right? But then so it's possible that an all-loving God could allow evil in the way that Hick says he could, right? But that doesn't actually explain the amount and extent and type of evil that premise 2 refers to when it says there is evil in the world. Right? Hick admits that there's an awful lot more evil in the world that seems unnecessary for the purposes of soul making, right? So, like, you could have a lot less evil in the world with beings who have free will. God could set it up in a way where we have the freedom that we need for soul making, but not so much freedom unregulated by God that things become as horrible as they become, right? So Hick is acknowledging that the argument only shows that premise 1 is false. It doesn't explain all the evil in the world, right? And Hick says to believe that all that extra evil is also somehow or another consistent with God requires faith that it'll all even out in the afterlife. And he acknowledges and admits that the believer, the atheist rather, is not going to be convinced by that argument, but that argument will only help the believer, right? So it's a limited question. It kind of begs the question a little bit, so to speak, because the atheist said, look, there's so much evil in the world that it's hard to believe in God. And he's saying, yeah, there is, but you have to have faith, right? But he's like, well, no, that was the whole point of the argument, that the amount of evil seems to be evidence against the existence of God. And you're saying, well, yeah, it is, but I have faith, right? So then you're not really addressing that second premise fully on its own terms, right? So, like, it's possible that there could be a loving God that allows that much evil in the world, but it's not plausible or credible. It's not really all that coherent to think that a loving God couldn't have made a better world with soul making and all that, and not as much pointless evil as there seems to be in the world. Okay? So now I'm going to critique some Hick's 2 theodicies, the one about human moral evil and the one about natural evil, like earthquakes. So starting with RR is me, that's the name of the slide, RR Critique of Free Will Theodicy. Okay, I say it's a false dichotomy or a false dilemma. False dilemma is something like when somebody says, look, there's either one or the other, and that's it, right? But really there's 3 or more choices, right? Then we call that a false dilemma. Di means 2 in Greek, like dialogue, 2 people speaking. Dilemma, lemma means branches. There's only 2 branches, or 2 options, right? Dichotomy means the same thing. So Hick's saying there's either free will and evil, or no evil and no free will. And I think that that's a false dichotomy. It ignores degrees in between, right? So Leibniz back there, who said this must be the best of all possible worlds, gave me the idea to think about when God's creating worlds, he can imagine all possible worlds, because he's all-knowing, right? And he can imagine every little detail in every world, every being and every kind of element like carbon, gold, whatever, things that make worlds, and different kinds of human beings with stronger bones, weaker bones, you name it. And he can also not only calculate all these different possible worlds with different kinds of beings and different laws of gravity, pitched slightly differently, because God can create all of that. But he could also say, okay, these are all the beings in world one, and Repeti makes this choice at this time, and that impacts everything this way. But then in possible world two, Repeti, everything else is the same, but Repeti makes the other choice, and then God can calculate all the possible outcomes, and he could do that for every single choice that Repeti makes, and for every other possible being in every other possible world. He can compute all of it, and he could pick out the best of all possible worlds, right? Which is the one where we have all the free will that we need for soul making, but not so much that things are so bad, and all the real world that's not a cartoon world that we need for soul making, but not one that's this dangerous, right? And then Leibniz's idea that this must be the best of all possible worlds, this doesn't look like it's that world. This does not look like the best of all possible worlds for purposes of soul making, right? So that's my criticism. God could have not only imagined the best of all possible worlds and picked the ones that are really good, right? That wouldn't be like the one that we're in. But like what would happen in those worlds is that we would be smarter, we would have more rubbery bones, we might be, like, just think about the difference between people who were born like Muhammad, Buddha, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Jesus, right? All these really good beings, Einstein or whatever. Why are they all born with all these different abilities as opposed to some mass murderer and everything, right? So if all souls are equal and pure and innocent, why are they put in these different kinds of bodies and circumstances? One's born in the ghetto, one is born rich, right? God could have he could have picked the worlds where that wouldn't be such these terrible disparities, right? And good, worlds that don't have the diseases, where there's more abundance and everything else, right? God could have also rearranged all the circumstances and conditions the way things are laid out, like not put the tree in the Garden of Eden, that kind of thing. God could have set things up in a way that they work. Like one of the analogies that I might like to, like God could have made us all like Moses or Mahatma Gandhi or something like that. Moses made mistakes, but he wasn't evil like Hitler, One of the analogies I like to make is I have fish tanks. I've been collecting fish and snakes and turtles and frogs and things like since I was a kid, but many fish tanks over the years, and you learn like what's a good kind of lighting, what's a good kind of heater, what's a good kind of filter system, and how much to feed, not too much, not too little. You test the water for the pH to make sure that you don't kill the fish. And like over the years, you learn how to make better and better fish tanks, and they're your pets and you care about them, and you don't set the thing up intentionally so that periodically the heater or the light falls in and electrocutes the fish and stuff like that, right? If you care about even your fish, you set up a world, an aquarium, that is conducive to their well-being, right? And this world, by analogy, is like God's aquarium, and we're his pets, right? Why would you set it up in such a way that tsunamis and diseases and plagues and earthquakes and all these horrible things happen? That's not very plausible, right? So that's the fish tank analogy. Okay. So now, and that applies to my critique of the soul making. Next slide, or our critique of soul making theodicy, which, like I said, Hick sometimes restricts that term to the non-cartoon world part of it. I have the same criticism. That's another false dichotomy. Either we're in a perfectly cartoon-like, dream-like, utopian world, right, where nobody could ever cultivate any virtues like compassion or generosity or courage, or we're in this horrible, ugly world that's so dangerous, right? No, God could have imagined all possible worlds and picked one that was a little better than this one. In fact, a lot better than this one, right? With just enough tolerable consequences and injuries and challenges, right? On my slide, it says parent-child question mark, right? Like when a parent has an infant, right, they baby-proof the living room, and and when they have to leave things that are dangerous out, they put the baby in the playpen where it's safe. They don't leave guns and knives and grenades and sharp objects, ice picks and things like that in the playpen or in the living room and let the child run around, right? We expose our children to dangers at a rate at which they can grow from them without killing themselves, right? God as parent has not done that in the structuring of this world. That's a criticism, right, of the idea that, no, God could have made a better playpen or a fish tank or whatever for us, right? We could have had slightly stronger bodies, more rubbery bones, better brains, and all with that, and maintaining laws of nature, right? It could have been better. In fact, human beings with science are trying to make better bodies, better brains, and better world, right? And we're just human, and we're trying to do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, all right? So that's the objection to both. The free will dichotomy, which says we either have free will and lots of evil, the amount we have, or we're robots with no free will, that's a false dichotomy. We could have enough free will, but not that much, right? Similarly, we could be in a world with consequences not as bad as this one, okay? All right, so also, next slide, which says ignores what God can do, right? Hick's argument ignores that God could intervene, right, to prevent evil. Like, he could have the world be just the way that it is, right? Even as dangerous as it is. But when things are about to go bad, God could intervene and we wouldn't even know. Like Hurricane Sandy, I remember watching the news and they were saying, right before it happened, well, there's this constellation of factors. There's a high tide. There's this currents coming in from the south that make the water warmer or cooler or whatever. And there's barometric pressure, and then there's the wind, velocity, and this and that. And if all these factors combine in the wrong way, we're going to have a big problem, right? But if any one of them changes and we're lucky and the current shifts or the temperature changes or whatever, then we're going to be spared, right? Now, God could have just zapped one of those details and nobody would have known. They would have said, oh, thank God, the temperature changed, or the wind currents moved, or the water currents moved, or the tide got lower, or whatever, right? We would have never known. Similarly, God could make the gun jam in the case where that guy went in New England and shot up all those children in his school, right? Little kids, right? Nobody would have known that God jammed the gun, right? God could have sent a mentor into young Adolf Hitler's life, right? So that he wouldn't grow up hating so much. Or, zapped him and gave him a heart attack or something like that. It's just his time, right? But not in a cartoon world at all. In the world just as it is, God could selectively intervene to prevent the massive excesses that Hick himself acknowledges. There's way more here than we need for soul making. God could prevent those from happening, but he doesn't. All right? I also say that this would not be a cartoon world. It would be a real world with real consequences. But heaven is a cartoon world, right? So now I want to share with you Bertrand Russell, famous philosopher and mathematician of the 20th century, what he called, or what I would say, he criticized what could be called an afterlife inference, making an inference that this world is really bad, because Hick says, yes, this world really is bad, but if you have faith, you infer that the afterlife must be better, and it'll all be just and good and even out in the afterlife, right? So Bertrand Russell criticizes that idea. And he says, look, if you have a crate of fruit, like, when you go to the supermarket and you pick up a thing of strawberries, you lift it up to look at the bottom, but they've got that thing blocking it, so you can't see if they're molded at the bottom. But if they were molded on top, you would put it back, because you don't infer, oh, the fruit that I could see is rotten. Therefore, the fruit that I can't see must be good, right? Nobody infers or reasons like that. But the inference that Hick makes on faith, that, oh yeah, this world apparently stinks, but the next world must smell like roses. That's like inferring that the fruit that I see on top of the crate is bad, so all the rest of the fruit must be the good fruit. That could only be true if you already presuppose that we're in a just world, right? If you already accept the just world premise, that no matter what happens, the world is just, you can't make that inference, right? And so if you don't already accept that God exists and God guarantees a just world, you can't make that inference, right? Because the inference on its own doesn't make sense. And in the context of the argument from evil, the evidence is that all the fruit that we see, a lot of it is rotten. So it doesn't make sense to infer that the fruit that we don't see is not rotten, okay? All right, so next slide, Kahn. Stephen Kahn is at the CUNY Graduate Center, by the way. I know him. This slide says Kahn, reverse theodicy. So Kahn, I think he's an observant, maybe even Orthodox Jew. I'm not sure if I remember him wearing a yarmulke, but I believe he is a religiously observant Jew. I'm not sure, but it doesn't matter. Suppose that he is, right? But he says, you know what? Like, even though he seems to strike me as a believer, right? He's saying that argument stinks because the same exact logic can be reversed. You can do a reverse theodicy, right? If the evil that we see can be explained or justified as necessary in some way for some greater good that God has in store for us that we don't see, then the opposite holds equally well, right? In other words, then the goodness that we see in the world can be explained or justified as necessary for some greater evil that Satan has in store for us, right? So when bad things happen, we go, oh, you know, everything happens for a reason, right? And usually whenever we say that, it's because something bad happened, right? And that's just a way of saying we believe in the afterlife inference, right? Or in the later in this life inference, that God will make it good later on in this life, that God enables and allows and knows about everything, no matter how bad things seem to be or what terrible tragedies befall some innocent infant, right? It's for a good reason that we just can't understand, right? I'm not so sure that that works. So, well, at least what Kant is trying to say is that the logic is the same, right? If the evil that we see can be explained by good that we don't see, then the good that we see could be explained by the evil that we don't see, right? It could be God that's behind the universe, or it could be evil that's behind the universe, right? Okay. So I mentioned the idea that the believer says everything happens for a reason. That's my next slide. RR, Rick Rapetti, everything happens for a reason. I call this the aphorism. And it's like the most popular, an aphorism is a saying, like a proverb or a platitude. It's, common wisdom in kind of cliches or phrases that people repeat, right? The saying, everything happens for a reason, that aphorism is, I think, the most popular meme, which is just an idea that gets repeated in human history. Right? So I say that believers in the aphorism think it makes sense because they perhaps unconsciously think that the universe is governed or designed by a system of good purposes, usually by God. But with Kant's reverse theodicy, for every conceivable but hidden good reason or purpose that could explain a seemingly bad or evil event, there's an equally conceivable but hidden bad reason or purpose that could explain every conceivable good event. Therefore, all of the evidence in the world, we have good things happening and bad things happening, right? All of the evidence is equally consistent with both of those hypotheses, right? That the universe is governed by a good being or by an evil being or by both beings that are in conflict with each other. And that's what some religious folks say. Well, it's not just God, it's the devil. But according to the religions that believe in God and the devil, God created the devil, right? So, and allegedly gave half of his power to the devil if the devil could be the source of all the evil in the world, right? That doesn't make sense either. But the point is, the evidence is that there's good and bad things that happen in the world. So if you want to flip, good things are evidence of bad things, just as much as bad things are evidence of good things. So that kind of argument cancels itself out. That's, I think, the point that Hick makes. So on my next slide, I give some examples, like someone gives money to charity, that's the example, but the reply or the explanation would be, they're unconsciously trying to pay for their sins. Another example, someone's very honest. The reply is, that's so someone else can see the opportunity to take advantage of them and become lured by evil, right? Another example, someone saves a child's life. The reply could be, that's because that child has a great role to play in Satan's evil master plan. That's a little Adolf Hitler there, right? Someone could make the objection against Kant's reverse theodicy and just wait, there's way too much goodness in the world, or in this case or in that case, right, for the world to be governed by Satan. And then ironically, the person can say in reply to that objection, but Satan's ways are beyond human comprehension. Hopefully that rings a bell for you, because normally when the argument doesn't work for the believer says, well, God's ways are beyond human comprehension. One other thing that I would say, that's my last slide, but I will say this. Abigail Rosenthal, who wrote the book, A Good Look at Evil, professor at Brooklyn College when I was a student there and when I was teaching there. I never took her class, but she was the advisor for the Philosophy Club, which I was the president and founder of. It's still running, by the way. Philosophy Society, we called it. Remember her definition of evil, I believe it was in this lecture or the previous lecture, I don't remember. Oh, and I think it was this lecture, yeah. That it's the intent that matters. It's the intention to cause other innocent beings to suffer precisely in order to be able to enjoy the pleasure of seeing them suffer, of seeing innocent people suffer. That's a purely evil motive. And then, of course, some motives could approximate that. Now, I remember her also saying that a really evil person, and I think she was speaking from experience, is somebody who gets into your good graces and learns about your values and your beliefs and your goals and your life plans and the trajectory of your ongoing value developing projects in life, just so that they can really understand the best way to crush and dash all of your hopes, right? It's a frightening thought, but unfortunately it happens to people, right? Particularly when they get into a relationship with somebody who's an exploiter, a manipulator, a user, or a sociopath or something like that. The person uses their wits to figure out how to defeat this person or just exploit them endlessly. But a truly evil person would want to get the greatest rush out of your suffering. They would want to build up your hope to the highest possible level and get you to think that everything is great and it's about to get better and you're just about to come to fruition and success, and then cut you in half, right? So arguably, just someone making Stephen Kahn's argument about the reverse theodicy could say that all of the good in the world, right, to make this argument on a grand scale, just like the theodicy that would defend all the evil in the world says all the evil in the world, like Leibniz said, is for this greater divine plan of God's, which is ultimately good. You could equally make an equally logically coherent, logically identical argument to the effect that all of the good in the world is precisely and only allowed by an all evil being because it leads to greater evil. Right? Do you understand that? Right? How would a good God allow evil in the world only because God is good, but he allows evil because it leads to a greater good? But a cosmic evil being who is all powerful and all knowing, but all evil instead of all good. How could a Satanist, let's just say, like a young Satanist might say to the elder Satanist, but if the world is governed by Satan, how do you explain all the good in the world? All these really good things that happen? Oh, my son, our God, Satan, only allows all these good things to happen so that he can then dash the hopes of all those people who had faith in the good. Satan's greater evil plan explains it all, right? So the point is not to argue that, oh, look, there's good and evil in the world, and maybe all the good is because of Satan secretly, and all the evil is because of God secretly, or to say which one of those makes more sense, right? But simply to say both of them are logically equivalent, right? Logically equivalent. And that undermines both of them, right? So that's, I think, my summary of Kant's reverse theodicy. Now, I'll say one more thing before we go on. The one thing that was left really unresolved, but one of the most strongest things that was left unresolved, is the excess amount of evil, and why doesn't God intervene to prevent it? And that will come up in the next readings. All right, why doesn't God intervene? The next reading by B.C. Johnson. And another one, I'm not sure if I assigned it in this class, but by Bruce Russell, not Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell is the rotten fruit example. Bruce Russell is still alive. But both Bruce Russell and B.C. Johnson write identically titled articles, Why Doesn't God Intervene to Prevent Evil? So they're kind of picking up where Hick leaves off, right? You say, okay, Hick's argument accounts for enough evil for soul making, but there's all that extra evil. Why doesn't God intervene to prevent that? That's what the next readings are about. That's how the sequence goes. So this is going to show you this is a series of arguments that is multiply complex, and we're only touching on a few of them. And this is the nature of philosophy. Just one concept or two, God and evil, to try to understand the relationship between the two of them is incredibly complex. All right, so that's it for this one.